Bueno, hablamos con un caballero británico millonario al que le encanta comprar agencias de publicidad, de hecho lo viene haciendo hace más de 40 años. Bueno, justamente a él le preguntamos su visión y le pedimos que haga un análisis de las últimas novedades. Obviamente nos referimos a la adquisición que realizó Omnicom de todo el grupo IPG. Escuchemos la visión de Sir Martin Sorrell.
Very little strategic rationale in the sense of, I think the only thing strategically it does is it concentrates the business more in the US. I think certainly prior to or at the time of the announcement a year ago, it would end up with 57% of the company, the combined company, being in the US, and the US will continue to be strong, and having a strong business in the US makes sense. Having said that, I see little strategic merit beyond that. I don't see it as helping from significantly from a data point of view or a digital media point of view. I don't think IPG adds much to Omnicom, and they trumpet a fair bit around it, but I don't think it really adds much in the way of technology or data or digital. But what it does do is add scale and focuses the business in the US, as I say, at around 60%. Having said that, I think the primary motivation, well, there might be several motivations. The primary motivation, I think, is around increased scale in the part of the market. I mean, you and others think about our market being one market. It isn't really. It's two markets. It's a market that's overall, it's about $1 trillion last year, about 1.1 trillion this year, and 1.2 next year. So it's growing about 10%. But the growth is coming from the digital piece, which was 700 billion last year, not from the traditional piece, which was 300 billion and was going backwards. So the traditional piece around free-to-air TV primarily, which Warner Brothers Discovery in a way epitomizes, and the fight between Paramount and Netflix is a fight over an increased position in that 300 billion. That sort of mirrors what I think Omnicom and IPG are doing. They're bulking up effectively in that part of the market, that 300 billion, which is declining. They're not bulking up in the 700 billion, which is growing significantly. So I think Omnicom has gone X growth, and what he sees also as an opportunity to get some growth in profitability by cutting costs. So this is a cost-cutting, capacity reduction move in the traditional part of the business. I don't think it does much around AI. I don't think it does much around data and digital. They will claim differently, but I think what it gives them is a bit more scale. But that scale is only really of value in the traditional part of the market, that 300 billion that's declining, rather than the 700 billion which is growing. In that 700 billion that's growing, you need tech, you need data, you need distribution, and that's what I think are the key things.
Para Sorrell hay una gran diferenciación entre lo que tiene que ver con el mercado publicitario tradicional y lo que tiene que ver con el digital. Y en su opinión, Omnicom está mal posicionado para el mercado que tiene mayor crecimiento. Escúchalo.
Companies like Omnicom, like IPG, like WPP, like Dentsu have much higher percentages in that declining part of the market. And I think analysts like you and journalists like you should really split it into two. The digital part of the market this year probably growing at 10, 15, 20%, depending which platform you're talking about. So, and that was the case last year. And of course, if you look at the $1 trillion, 700 billion in digital, Google's 250 billion. So it's 25% of the total, almost a third of digital. Meta is 150 billion, 15% of the total, 20% of digital. Amazon, 6% of the total, about 10% of digital. And TikTok outside China, about 40 billion, 4% of the total, about 5 or 6% of the digital market. Those four platforms, three Western and one Eastern, with its operations in the West, account for a half of the total market and 5/7 of the digital market. So they account for 70%, and that's where the growth is. So, but that is a very concentrated market. There are 6 platforms which I've gone through with you. So it's Alphabet, it's Meta, it's Amazon, it's Alibaba, it's Tencent, and it's ByteDance. And those are the 6 platforms, and they dominate the industry. And because of their investment, the hyperscalers' investment in AI and data and energy, they're spending. They get forecast to spend about 530 billion. The hyperscalers between them next year. This year probably they'll be up about at least 30% on what they spent this year. So this year they're close to a trillion, and next year they'll be well over it. And the amounts look as though they're going to increase. So they are going to reinforce their position. And you add to those 6, Apple and Microsoft. It's 19 billion of ad revenues. Apple around 11, and then you drop down to Snap at 6. Twitter used to be 5. There's X. It's now more like 2.5, 3, and then Walmart probably around 3. Netflix maybe around 1. I mean, you get down. I mean, it's the big boys. So I would say there's 6 platforms plus Microsoft plus Apple plus Nvidia, of course, plus Adobe, Oracle, and Salesforce. With Microsoft and Apple, I think those are going to be the big players, and they're going to reinforce their position, particularly in that 700 billion, which is 70% of the market now. When we started S4, it was about 50% 5 or 6 years ago, and we're forecasting, and others are forecasting, that digital will be 80% of the market by 2030.
Pero entonces, ¿cuáles son las empresas publicitarias que están mejor posicionadas? Sorrell, por favor, ilumínanos.
Havas is the other one that's been performing slightly better. That might be because it's a smaller scale, but essentially you'd have to say Publicis is doing a better job because, as I say, whether that is going to deliver what that story says is another question. But the signs so far are that, they have gained share. They've been growing at 4 or 5%, whilst all the other holding companies have been sort of flat or down.
También le preguntamos acerca de la desaparición de agencias publicitarias legendarias. Esto es lo que dijo.
It's interesting, the way the WPP has done it is a disaster. I mean, to lose the power of JWT. I mean, I'm here in India, where JWT was godlike, just like Ogilvy is godlike here and still is. But so the same was true of Y&R and Wonderman here. To lose the power of those brands is a dreadful mistake, particularly if you do it quickly. If you do it by sort of diktat, by PR release, you sit in your office at Sea Container House in London and you write a press release and, we're going to merge Y&R and Wonderman and JWT and we're going to call it VML. I mean, nobody knows VML, or didn't know, certainly, at the time, VML anywhere in the world except Kansas City. Maybe Kelsey and Taylor Swift knew VML because it was at the airport in Kansas City, but nobody else did. Now, you could argue they're creating it, but I think, so I would say if it's done carefully, if you retire those brands carefully, and Publicis went through a very tough time too. They did it, I think, a little bit more delicately, to get to one Publicis, and they, retired some of their storied agency brands. WPP did it in almost a Luddite manner, by press release, talked about simplification, and it was that's fine. But it was simplification overnight, and we're paid to manage complexity, not simplify things. In essence, we are attached to these brands. We are in the business of brand building. Clients find it very difficult to understand why we destroy these brands in a Luddite way. They think of us being preservers of brands and builders of brands. So in a funny way, I think the way Publicis did it quite violently. I think they moved quite quickly, maybe not as quickly or indiscriminately as WPP. I think Omnicom actually did it up until the merger with, or the announcement of the final merger with IPG. I think they were doing it delicately and intelligently and nudging it towards a consolidation. But ultimately these businesses are going to become one brand, because what essentially they're trying to do is to provide a bundle of services and integrate them effectively for the benefit of the clients. I mean, if they're not going to do that, then from a client point of view, it doesn't make any sense.
Y no podemos dejar de preguntarle acerca de las novedades de Netflix queriendo adquirir Warner Bros. Discovery y Paramount queriendo interponerse en esta especie de guerra de lo que tiene que ver con el mundo del entretenimiento.
I mean, it's reminiscent of so AOL Time Warner and AT&T Time Warner, and there is not a good track record of the new and the old mixing, and clearly, but the Netflix management, you can't write them off. I mean, Reed Hastings, Greg Peters, Ted Sarandos have done an incredible job, and they have morphed, and they've never let Reed Hastings, who sort of said, "Over my dead body we'll do advertising." Well, he's still alive, and they're advertising. So they're not frightened to change the shibboleths or change the rules if they think it's the right thing to do, and if they acknowledge that they made a misjudgment, or they correct the judgment that they made to change their positioning. So never write them off. I mean, the Ellison bid with Paramount is sort of more the old with the old, and more like an IPG Omnicom merger. I mean, that's another merger which is really dominating the 300 billion rather than the 700 billion. What's interesting about Netflix is they come from the digital side, obviously from the streaming side, and maybe the library and the assets that they will be acquiring will give them scope to develop the digital side even further. But it's a big management task, and it's mixing. It may be oil and water. We don't know. But I would never underestimate the wisdom or effectiveness of the Netflix management. Neither would I underestimate the effectiveness or wisdom of the Ellison management. They're not dummies either. So they'll. But it's a very different approach between the two, and it's sort of certainly the Paramount WBD move reminds me a lot of the IPG Omnicom one. That there will be a reduction of capacity in various areas, a streamlining, and an attempt to leverage the assets in a more effective way.
Y finalmente nos habló de todo lo que tiene que ver con la inteligencia artificial y particularmente cómo lo está abordando él, o más bien su empresa, S4 Capital.
Very focused on the tech side of the business. Half of our revenues by and large come from the big tech companies, most of which we've talked about already. Those companies, as I've said before, are growing in terms of ad revenues, but they're not spending increasing amounts on marketing spend or OPEX. They're spending more and more money on CAPEX. So I think our future depends on a couple of things. Firstly, adoption of AI. We've seen adoption in autos with GM and BMW, and in financial services in response to companies like Nubank that we work with in Brazil and in Latin America. But essentially, there has not been a widespread adoption of AI as yet. There have been tests, workshops, experiments, but there hasn't been wholehearted adoption. The reason there has in autos is because of the Chinese AVs and EVs. They can produce cars at $10,000 an AV, BYD, with God's Eye, what they call God's Eye, their technology, or $25,000 for EVs, which compares very well with a Tesla, lowest price Tesla at $35,000. And then in financial services, the branch banks like HSBC and Santander have had to move quickly to try and be as flexible and responsive and data-driven and consumer-driven as the other companies, as the new fintech platforms. But that's been an external financial force which has pushed them into doing more. We haven't seen that in other verticals. Now, as we get into 26, if the economy does tighten, particularly after the US midterms, growth is a little bit slower, inflation is a little bit more stubborn, interest rates a little bit higher. Maybe that will produce the economic pressures needed to make AI adoption stronger. And then the second thing is that maybe the competition, particularly from the Chinese, who seem to be able to produce technology at cheaper prices, as effective but at cheaper prices, that competition will force the tech companies to be a little bit more aggressive in their marketing spending.
Bueno, tal vez Sir Martin no nos contó, por lo menos en esta ocasión, cómo volvernos millonarios, ni cómo ser nombrados caballeros prácticamente de la nobleza británica, pero sí nos compartió su visión y su análisis de estos cambios tectónicos que está habiendo en la publicidad. Y este es un contenido exclusivo de Insider, así que ya sabes dónde seguir las mejores novedades del marketing en Hispanoamérica.